Once on a Time by A. Milne. Read for Alitheia Audio by R.L. Wolfe. Chapter 1. The King of Euralia has a visitor to breakfast. King Merriwig of Euralia sat at breakfast on his castle walls. He lifted the gold cover from the gold dish in front of him, selected a trout, and conveyed it carefully to his gold plate. He was a man of simple tastes, but when you have an aunt with the newly acquired gift of turning anything she touches to gold, you must let her practice sometimes. In another age, it might have been fretwork.
"Ah," said the king, "here you are, my dear."
He searched for his napkin, but the princess had already kissed him lightly on the top of the head and was sitting in her place opposite to him. "Good morning, father," she said. "I'm a little late, aren't I? I've been riding in the forest."
"Any adventures?"
asked the king casually. "Nothing, except it's a beautiful morning."
"Ah, well, perhaps the country isn't what it was. Now, when I was a young man, you simply couldn't go into the forest without an adventure of some sort. The extraordinary things one encountered. Witches, giants, dwarfs. It was there that I first met your mother," he added thoughtfully.
"I wish I remembered my mother," said Hyacinth. The king coughed and looked at her a little nervously.
17 years ago she died, Hyacinth, when you were only 6 months old. I have been wondering lately whether I haven't been a little remiss in leaving you motherless so long."
The princess looked puzzled. "But it wasn't your fault, dear, that mother died."
"Oh, no, I'm not saying that. As you know, a dragon carried her off and, well, there it was. But supposing," he looked at her shyly, "I had married again."
The princess was startled. "Who?" she asked. The king peered into his flagon.
"Well," he said, "there are people."
"If it had been somebody very nice," said the princess wistfully, "it might have been rather lovely." The king gazed earnestly at the outside of his flagon.
"Why, might have been," he said.
The princess was still puzzled. "But I'm grown up," she said. "I don't want a mother so much now." The king turned his flagon round and studied the other side of it.
"A mother's, tender hand," he said, "is, never—"
And then the outrageous thing happened. It was all because of a birthday present to the king of Barodia, and the present was nothing less than a pair of 7-league boots. The king, being a busy man, it was a week or more before he had an opportunity of trying those boots. Meanwhile, he used to talk about them at meals, and he would polish them up every night before he went to bed. When the great day came for the first trial of them to be made, he took a patronizing farewell of his wife and family, ignored the many eager noses pressed against the upper windows of the palace, and sailed off. The motion, as perhaps you know, is a little disquieting at first, but one soon gets used to it. After that, it is fascinating. He had gone some 2,000 miles before he realized that there might be a difficulty about finding his way back. The difficulty proved at least as great as he anticipated. For the rest of that day, he toured backwards and forwards across the country, and it was by the merest accident that a very angry king shot in through an open pantry window in the early hours of the morning. He removed his boots and went softly to bed. It was, of course, a lesson to him. He decided that in the future he must proceed by a recognized route, sailing lightly from landmark to landmark. Such a route his geographers prepared for him. An early morning constitutional of 300 miles or so, to be taken 10 times before breakfast. He gave himself a week in which to recover his nerve, and then started out on the first of them. Now the kingdom of Euralia adjoined that of Barodia, but whereas Barodia was a flat country, Euralia was a land of hills. It was natural, then, that the court geographers, in search of landmarks, should have looked towards Euralia, and over Euralia accordingly, about the time when cottage and castle alike were breakfasting, The king of Barodia soared and dipped and soared and dipped again.
"A mother's tender hand," said the king of Euralia, "is, never... Good gracious! What's that?"
There was a sudden rush of air. Something came for a moment between his majesty and the sun, and then all was quiet again. "What was it?" asked Hyacinth, slightly alarmed.
"Most extraordinary," said the king. "It left in my mind an impression of ginger whiskers and large boots. Do we know anybody like that?"
"The king of Barodia," said Hyacinth, "has red whiskers, but I don't know about his boots."
"But what could he have been doing up there? Unless—"
There was another rush of wind in the opposite direction. Once more the sun was obscured, and this time, plain for a moment for all to see, appeared the rapidly dwindling back view of the king of Barodia on his way home to breakfast. Merriwig rose with dignity.
"You're quite right, Hyacinth," he said sternly. "It was the king of Barodia."
Hyacinth looked troubled. "He oughtn't to come over anybody's breakfast table quite so quickly as that. Ought he, father?"
"A lamentable display of manners, my dear. I shall withdraw now and compose a stiff note to him. The amenities must be observed."
Looking as severe as a naturally jovial face would permit him, and wondering a little if he had pronounced amenities right, he strode to the library. The library was His Majesty's favorite apartment. Here in the mornings he would discuss affairs of state with his chancellor, or receive any distinguished visitors who were to come to his kingdom in search of adventure. Here in the afternoon, with a copy of What to Say to a Wizard, or some such book taken at random from the shelves, he would give himself up to meditation. And it was the distinguished visitors of the morning who gave him most to think about in the afternoon. There were at this moment no fewer than 7 different princes engaged upon 7 different enterprises, to whom, in the event of a successful conclusion, he had promised the hand of Hyacinth and half his kingdom. No wonder he felt that she needed the guiding hand of a mother. The stiff note to Barodia was not destined to be written. He was still hesitating between 2 different kinds of nib, when the door was flung open and the fateful name of the Countess Belvane was announced. The Countess Belvane! What can I say which will bring home to you that wonderful, terrible, fascinating woman? Mastered as she was by overweening ambition, utterly unscrupulous in her methods of achieving her purpose, nonetheless her adorable humanity betrayed itself in a passion for diary-keeping and a devotion to the simpler forms of lyrical verse. That she is the villain of the piece, I know well. In his Euralia Past and Present, the eminent historian Roger Scurvylegs does not spare her. But that she had her great qualities, I should be the last to deny. She had been writing poetry that morning, and she wore green. She always wore green when the muse was upon her. A pleasing habit which, whether as a warning or an inspiration, modern poets might do well to imitate. She carried an enormous diary under her arm, and in her mind several alternative ways of putting down her reflections on her way to the palace.
"Good morning, dear Countess,"
said the king, rising only too gladly from his nibs.
"An early visit."
"You don't mind, your Majesty?" said the Countess anxiously. "There was a point in our conversation yesterday about which I was not quite certain."
"What were we talking about yesterday?"
"Oh, your Majesty," said the Countess, "affairs of state."
And she gave him that wicked, innocent, impudent, and entirely scandalous look which he never could resist, and you couldn't either for that matter.
"Affairs of state, of course," smiled the king.
"Why, I made a special note of it in my diary."
She laid down the enormous volume and turned lightly over the pages.
"Here we are. Thursday. His Majesty did me the honor to consult me about the future of his daughter, the Princess Hyacinth. Remained to tea and was I can't quite make this word out."
"Let me look," said the king,
his rubicund face becoming yet more rubicund.
"It looks like charming,"
he said casually.
"Fancy,"
said Belvane.
"Fancy my writing that. I put down just what comes into my head at the time, you know."
She made a gesture with her hand indicative of someone who puts down just what comes into her head at the time, and returned to her diary.
"Remained to tea and was very charming. Mused afterwards on the mutability of life."
She looked up at him with wide open eyes.
"I often muse when I'm alone," she said.
The king still hovered over the diary.
"Have you any more entries like that last one? May I look?"
"Oh, your majesty, I'm afraid it's quite private."
She closed the book quickly.
"I just thought I saw some poetry,"
said the king.
"Just a little ode to a favorite linnet. It wouldn't interest your majesty."
"I adore poetry,"
said the king, who had himself written a rhymed couplet, which could be said either forwards or backwards, and in the latter position was useful for removing enchantments. According to the eminent historian Roger Scurvylegs, it had some vogue in Euralia, and went like this. Bo bowl, bill bowl, woe wowl, will wowl. A pleasing idea, temperately expressed. The Countess, of course, was only pretending. Really, she was longing to read it. "It's quite a little thing," she said.
"Hail to thee, blithe linnet, bird thou clearly art, that from bush or in it pourest thy full heart, and leads the feathered choir in song, taking the treble part."
"Beautiful,"
said the king, and one must agree with him. Many years after, another poet called Shelley plagiarized the idea, but handled it in a more artificial and, to my way of thinking, decidedly inferior manner.
"Was it a real bird?"
said the king.
"An old favorite."
"Was it pleased about it?"
"Alas, your majesty, it died without hearing it."
"Poor bird,"
said his majesty.
"I think it would have liked it."
Meanwhile, Hyacinth, innocent of the nearness of a mother, remained on the castle walls and tried to get on with her breakfast. But she made little progress with it. After all, it is annoying continually to look up from your bacon or whatever it is and see a foreign monarch passing overhead. 18 more times the King of Barodia took Hyacinth in his stride. At the end of the performance, feeling rather giddy, she went down to her father. She found him alone in the library, a foolish smile upon his face, but no sign of a letter to Barodia in front of him. "Have you sent the note yet?" she asked.
Note, he said, bewildered. "What? Oh, you mean the stiff note to the King of Barodia. I'm just planning it, my love. The exact shade of stiffness combined with courtesy is a little difficult to hit."
"I shouldn't be too courteous," said Hyacinth. "He came over 18 more times after you'd gone."
18? My dear, it's outrageous.
"I've never had such a crowded breakfast before."
"It's positively insulting, Hyacinth. This is no occasion for notes. We will talk to him in a language that he will understand."
And he went out to speak to the captain of his archers. Chapter 2. The Chancellor of Barodia has a long walk home. Once more, it was early morning on the castle walls. The king sat at his breakfast table, a company of archers drawn up in front of him.
"Now you all understand," he said. "When the King of when he's certain... Well, when I say when, I want you all to fire your arrows into the air. You are to take no aim. You are just to shoot your arrows upwards, and, I want to see who gets highest. Should anything brush up against them on their way, not of course that it's likely, well, in that case, something will, brush up against them. After all, what should?
Quite so, sire, said the captain. Or rather, not at all.
Very well. To your places.
Each archer fitted an arrow to his bow and took up his position. A lookout man had been posted. Everything was ready. The king was decidedly nervous. He wandered from one archer to another, asking after this man's wife and family, praising the polish on that man's quiver, or advising him to stand with his back a little more to the sun. Now and then he would hurry off to the lookout man on a distant turret, point out Barodia on the horizon to him, and hurry back again. The lookout knew all about it.
"Royalty over!"
he bellowed suddenly.
"When?"
roared the king, and a cloud of arrows shot into the air.
"Well done!"
cried Hyacinth, clapping her hands.
"I mean, how could you? You might have hurt him."
"Hyacinth," said the king, turning suddenly. "You here?"
"I have just come up. Did you hit him?"
"Hit who?"
"The king of Barodia, of course."
"The king of... My dear child, what could the king of Barodia be doing here? My archers were aiming at a hawk that they saw in the distance."
He beckoned to the captain.
"Did you hit that hawk?" he asked.
"With one shot only, sire? In the whisk, in the tail feathers?" The king turned to Hyacinth.
"With one shot only in the whisk, in the tail feathers," he said. "What was it, my dear, that you were saying about the king of Barodia?"
"Oh, father, you are bad. You hit the poor man right in the whisker."
"His Majesty of Barodia? And in the whisker? My dear child, this is terrible. But what can he have been doing up there? Dear, this is really most unfortunate. I must compose a note of apology about this."
"I should leave the first note to him," said Hyacinth.
Yes, you're right. No doubt he will wish to explain how he came to be there. Just a moment, dear."
He went over to his archers, who were drawn up in line again.
"You may take your men down now,"
he said to the captain.
"Yes, your Majesty."
His Majesty looked quickly round the castle walls, and then leant confidentially towards the captain.
Which was the man who,
He fingered his cheek.
Quite so. The one on the left. Ah, yes."
He went to the man on the left and put a bag of gold into his hand.
"You have a very good style with the bow, my man. Your wrist action is excellent. I've never seen an arrow go so high."
The company saluted and withdrew. The king and Hyacinth sat down to breakfast.
"A little mullet, my dear," he said.
The hereditary Grand Chancellor of Barodia never forgot that morning, nor did he allow his wife to forget it. His opening, "That reminds me, dear, of the day when," though the signal of departure for any guests, allowed no escape for his family. They had to have it. And indeed it was a busy day for him. Summoned to the palace at 9 o'clock, he found the king nursing a bent whisker and in the very vilest of tempers. His Majesty was for war at once. The Chancellor leant towards the stiff note. "At least, your Majesty," he begged, "let me consult the precedents first."
"There is no precedent," said the king coldly, "for such an outrage as this."
"Not precisely, sire, but similar unfortunate occurrences have occurred."
"It was worse than an occurrence."
"I should have said an outrage, your Majesty. Your late lamented grandfather was unfortunate enough to have come beneath the spell of the King of Araby, under which he was compelled, or perhaps I should say preferred,
to go about on his hands and knees for several weeks. Your Majesty may recall how the people, in their great loyalty, adopted a similar mode of progression. Now, although your Majesty's case is not precisely on all fours—"
"Not at all on all fours," said the king coldly.
"In an unfortunate metaphor, I should say that although your Majesty's case is not parallel, the procedure adopted in your revered grandfather's case—"
"I don't care what you do with your whiskers. I don't care what anybody does with his whiskers,"
said the king, still soothing his own tenderly.
"I want the king of Euralia's blood!"
He looked round the court.
"To anyone who will bring me the head of the king, I will give the hand of my daughter in marriage."
There was a profound silence. "Which daughter?" said a cautious voice at last.
"The eldest,"
said the king. There was another profound silence.
"My suggestion, your Majesty," said the Chancellor, "is that for the present there should be merely an exchange of stiff notes, and that meanwhile we scour the kingdom for an enchanter who shall take some pleasant revenge for us upon his Majesty of Euralia. For instance, sire, a king whose head has been permanently fixed on upside down lacks somewhat of that regal dignity which alone can command the respect of his subjects. A couple of noses, again, placed at different angles so they cannot both be blown together."
Yes, said the king impatiently. "I'll think of the things, if once you can find the enchanter, but they are not so common nowadays. Besides, enchanters are delicate things to work with. They have a habit of forgetting which side they are on."
The Chancellor's mouth drooped piteously.
"Well," said the king condescendingly, "I'll tell you what we'll do. You may send one stiff note, and then we will declare war."
"Thank you, your Majesty," said the Chancellor.
So the stiff note was dispatched. It pointed out that His Majesty of Barodia, while in the act of taking his early morning constitutional, had been severely insulted by an arrow. This arrow, though fortunately avoiding the more vital parts of His Majesty's person, went so far as to wound a favourite whisker. For this the fullest reparation must be made, and so forth and so on. Euralia's reply was not long delayed. It expressed the deepest concern at the unhappy accident which had overtaken a friendly monarch. On the morning in question, His Majesty had been testing his archers in a shooting competition at a distant hawk, which competition, it might interest His Majesty of Barodia to know, had been won by Henry Smallnose, a bowman of considerable promise. In the course of the competition, it was noticed that a foreign body of some sort brushed up against one of the arrows, but as this in no way affected the final placing of the competitors, little attention was paid to it. His Majesty of Barodia might rest assured that the king had no wish to pursue the matter farther. Indeed, he was always glad to welcome his Barodian Majesty on these occasions. Other shooting competitions would be arranged from time to time, and if His Majesty happened to be passing at the moment, the King of Euralia hoped that he would come down and join them, trusting that Her Majesty and their Royal Highnesses were well, and so on and so forth. The Grand Chancellor of Barodia read this answer to his stiff note with a growing feeling of uneasiness. It was he who had exposed His Majesty to this fresh insult, and unless he could soften it in some way, his morning at the palace might be a painful one. As he entered the precincts, he wondered whether the king would be wearing the famous boots, and whether they kicked 7 leagues as easily as they strode them. He felt more and more that there were notes which you could break gently, and notes which you couldn't. 5 minutes later, as he started on his 21-mile walk home, he realized that this was one of the ones which you couldn't. This, then, was the real reason of the war between Euralia and Barodia. I am aware that in saying this, I differ from the eminent historian Roger Scurvylegs. In Chapter 9 of his immortal work, Euralia Past and Present, he attributes the quarrel between the two countries to quite other causes. The king of Barodia, he says, demanded the hand of the Princess Hyacinth for his eldest son. The king of Euralia made some commonplace condition, as that his royal highness should first ride his horse up a glassy mountain in the district, a condition which his majesty of Barodia strongly resented. I am afraid that Roger is incurably romantic. I have had to speak to him about it before. There was nothing of the sentimental in the whole business, and the facts are exactly as I have narrated them. Chapter 3. The King of Euralia draws his sword. No doubt you have already guessed that it was the Countess Belvane who dictated the King of Euralia's answer. Left to himself, Merriwig would have said,
"Serve you jolly well right for stalking over my kingdom."
His repartee was never very subtle. Hyacinth would have said, "Of course we're awfully sorry, but a whisker isn't very bad, is it? And you really oughtn't to come to breakfast without being asked." The Chancellor would have scratched his head for a long time, and then said,
"Referring to Chapter 7, Para 259 of the King's Regulations, we notice."
But Belvane had her own way of doing things, and if you suggest that she wanted to make Barodia's declaration of war inevitable, well, the story will show whether you are right in supposing that she had her reasons. It came a little hard on the Chancellor of Barodia, but the innocent must needs suffer for the ambitions of the unprincipled. A maxim I borrow from Euralia Past and Present, Roger in his moral vein.
"Well,"
said Merriwig to the Countess,
"that's done it."
"Is it really war?"
asked Belvane.
"It is. Hyacinth is looking at my armor at this moment."
"What did the King of Barodia say?"
"He didn't say anything. He wrote W-A-R in red on a dirty bit of paper, pinned it to my messenger's ear, and sent him back again."
"How very crude," said the Countess.
"Oh, I thought it was, rather forcible,"
said the king awkwardly. Secretly, he had admired it a good deal and wished that he had been the one to do it.
"Of course," said the Countess with a charming smile, "that sort of thing depends so very much on who does it. Now, from your Majesty, it would have seemed dignified."
"He must have been very angry,"
said the king, picking up first one and then another of a number of swords which lay in front of him.
"I wish I had seen his face when he got my note."
"So do I,"
sighed the Countess. She wished it much more than the king. It is the tragedy of writing a good letter that you cannot be there when it is opened. A maxim of my own, the thought never having occurred to Roger Scurvylegs, who was a dull correspondent. The king was still taking up and putting down his swords.
"It's very awkward," he muttered. "I wonder if Hyacinth—"
He went to the door and called,
"Hyacinth!"
"Coming, father!"
called back Hyacinth from a higher floor. The Countess rose and curtsied deeply.
"Good morning, your Royal Highness."
"Good morning, Countess," said Hyacinth brightly. She liked the Countess. You couldn't help it, but rather wished she didn't.
"Oh, Hyacinth,"
said the king,
"come and tell me about these swords. Which is my magic one?"
Hyacinth looked at him blankly.
"Oh, father," she said, "I don't know at all. Does it matter very much?"
"My dear child, of course it matters. Supposing I am fighting the King of Barodia and I have my magic sword, then I'm bound to win. Supposing I haven't, then I'm not bound to."
"Supposing you both had magic swords,"
said Belvane. It was the sort of thing she would say. The king looked up slowly at her and began to revolve the idea in his mind.
"Well, really," he said, "I hadn't thought of that. Upon my word,
He turned to his daughter.
"Hyacinth, what would happen if we both had magic swords.
I suppose you'd go on fighting forever, said Hyacinth. Or until the magic wore out of one of them, said Belvane innocently.
There must be something about it somewhere, said the king, whose morning was in danger of being quite spoilt by this new suggestion. I'd ask the Chancellor to look it up, but he's so busy just now.
He'd have plenty of time while the combat was going on, said Belvane thoughtfully. Wonderful creature. She saw already the Chancellor hurrying up to announce that the King of Euralia had won, at the very moment when he lay stretched on the ground by a mortal thrust from his adversary. The king turned to his swords again.
Well, anyway, I'm going to be sure of mine, he said. Hyacinth, haven't you any idea which it is? He added in rather a hurt voice. Naturally, I left the marking of my swords to you.
His daughter examined the swords one by one. Here it is, she cried. It's got M on it, for magic.
Or Merriwig, said the Countess to her diary.
The expression of joy on the king's face at his daughter's discovery had just time to appear and fade away again.
You are not being very helpful this morning, Countess, he said severely.
Instantly the Countess was on her feet, her diary thrown to the floor. No, never thrown, laid gently on the floor, and herself, hands clasped at her breast, a figure of reproachful penitence before him.
Oh, your Majesty, forgive me. If your Majesty had only asked me. I didn't know your Majesty wanted me. I thought Her Royal Highness... But of course, I'll find your Majesty's sword for you.
Did she stroke his head as she said this? I have often wondered. It would be like her impudence and her motherliness and, in fact, like her. Euralia past and present is silent upon the point. Roger Scurvylegs, who had only seen Belvane at the unimpressionable age of 2, would have had it against her if he could, so perhaps there is nothing in it.
There,
she said, and she picked out the magic sword almost at once. Then I'll get back to my work, said Hyacinth cheerfully, and left them to each other. The king, smiling happily, girded on his sword, but a sudden doubt assailed him.
Are you sure it's the one?
Try it. On me, cried the Countess superbly, falling on her knees and stretching up her arms to him. The toe of her little shoe touched her diary. Its presence there uplifted her. Even as she knelt, she saw herself describing the scene. How do you spell offered? She wondered. I think the king was already in love with her, though he found it so difficult to say the decisive words. But even so, he could only have been in love a week or two, a fortnight in the last 40 years, and he had worn a sword since he was 12. In a crisis, it is the old love and not the greater love which wins. Roger's, but I think I agree with him. And instinctively, the king drew his sword. If it were magic, a scratch would kill. Now, he would know. Her enemies said that the Countess could not go pale. She had her faults, but this was not one of them. She whitened as she saw the king standing over her with drawn sword. 100 thoughts chased each other through her mind. She wondered if the king would be sorry afterwards. She wondered what the minstrels would sing of her, and if her diary would ever be made public. Most of all, she wondered why she had been such a fool, such a melodramatic fool. The king came to himself with a sudden start. Looking slightly ashamed, he put his sword back in its scabbard, coughed once or twice to cover his confusion, and held his hand out to the Countess to assist her to rise.
Don't be absurd, Countess, he said, as if we could spare you at a time like this. Sit down and let us talk matters over seriously.
A trifle bewildered by the emotion she had gone through, Belvane sat down, the beloved diary clasped tightly in her arms. Life seemed singularly sweet just then, the only drawback being that the minstrels would not be singing about her after all. Still, one cannot have everything. The king walked up and down the room as he talked.
I am going away to fight, he said, and I leave my dear daughter behind. In my absence, Her Royal Highness will, of course, rule the country. I want her to feel that she can lean upon you, Countess, for advice and support. I know that I can trust you, for you have just given me a great proof of your devotion and courage."
"Oh, your Majesty," said Belvane deprecatingly, but feeling very glad that it hadn't been wasted.
"Hyacinth is young and inexperienced. She needs
a mother's guiding hand," said Belvane softly. The king started and looked away. It was really too late to propose now. He had so much to do before the morrow. Better leave it till he came back from the war.
"You will have no official position," he went on hastily, "other than your present one of Mistress of the Robes, but your influence on her will be very great."
The Countess had already decided on this. However, there is a look of modest resignation to an unsought duty which is suited to an occasion of this kind, and the Countess had no difficulty in supplying it. "I will do all that I can, your Majesty, to help, gladly. But will not the Chancellor?"
"The Chancellor will come with me. He is no fighter, but he is good at spells."
He looked round to make sure that they were alone, and then went on confidentially.
"He tells me that he has discovered in the archives of the palace a backward spell of great value. Should he be able to cast this upon the enemy at the first onslaught, he thinks that our heroic army would have no difficulty in advancing."
"But there will be other learned men," said Belvane innocently, "so much more accustomed to affairs than us. Poor women, so much better able— what nonsense I'm talking," she said to herself, "to advise Her Royal Highness."
"Men like that," said the king, "I shall want with me also. If I am to invade Barodia properly, I shall need every man in the kingdom. Euralia must be, for the time, a country of women only."
He turned to her with a smile and said gallantly,
"That will be, it is, not, one may well,
It was so obvious from his manner that something complimentary was struggling to the surface of his mind that Belvane felt it would be kinder not to wait for it. "Oh, your Majesty," she said, "you flatter my poor sex."
"Not at all,"
said the king, trying to remember what he had said. He held out his hand.
"Well, Countess, I have much to do."
"I, too, your Majesty." She made him a deep curtsy, and clasping tightly the precious diary, withdrew. The king, who still seemed worried about something, returned to his table and took up his pen. Here Hyacinth discovered him 10 minutes later. His table was covered with scraps of paper, and her eyes lighting casually upon one of them, she read these remarkable words.
"In such a land I should be a most contented subject."
She looked at some of the others. They were even shorter.
"That dear Countess would be a country in which even a king— lucky country."
The last was crossed out and bad written against it. "Whatever are these, father?" said Hyacinth. The king jumped up in great confusion.
"Nothing, dear, nothing," he said. "I just, of course I shall have to address my people, and I was just jotting down a few— however, I shan't want them now."
He swept them together, screwed them up tight, and dropped them into a basket. And what became of them, you ask? Did they light the fires of the palace next morning? Well, now, here's a curious thing. In Chapter 10 of Euralia Past and Present, I happened across these words. "The king and all the men of the land having left to fight the wicked Barodians, Euralia was now a country of women only, a country in which even a king might be glad to be a subject." Now, what does this mean? Is it another example of literary theft? I have already had to expose Shelley.
Must I now drag into the light of day a still worse plagiarism by Roger Scurvylegs? The waste paper baskets of the palace were no doubt open to him as to so many historians, but should he not have made acknowledgments? I do not wish to be hard on Roger. That I differ from him on many points of historical fact has already been made plain, and will be made still more plain as my story goes on. But I have a respect for the man, and on some matters, particularly those concerning Prince Udo of Araby's first appearance in Euralia, I have to rely entirely upon him for my information. Moreover, I have never hesitated to give him credit for such of his epigrams as I have introduced into this book, and I like to think that he would be equally punctilious to others. We know his romantic way. No doubt the thought occurred to him independently. Let us put it at that, anyhow. Belvane, meanwhile, was getting on. The king had drawn his sword on her, and she had not flinched. As a reward, she was to be the power behind the throne. Not necessarily behind the throne, said Belvane to herself.